Welcome to Kingsclere in the 21st century. We're here to celebrate the history of Kingsclere over the last millennium. Here we are at the top of the tower in Kingsclere, and what a splendid view we have. In the distance we can see Watership Down, and then along the downs to Cottington Hill. And beneath us, spread out the village of Kingsclere. But first, Robert, was there a Kingsclere at the beginning of the millennium?
Yes, except that it wasn't called Kingsclere then, not until, as far as we know, the beginning of the 12th century. It was always simply called Clere. We got references to it in the will of King Alfred and of his grandson, King Edred. And that's the first we hear of the place, but it really gives us no information at all. It only really emerges into light when we come to the Domesday Book, and then we have ample information about what did become Kingsclere eventually.
Good. Now the church here was obviously the centre of the community. What do we know about the early history of the church here? Very
little. In the Domesday Book it's described as belonging to Queen Edith, the widow of Edward the Confessor. And it belonged to her. Fairly small manor here. She had many manors right across the country, and she retained them until about 1875 when she died, and when, of course, William the Conqueror took them all in hand. At that time he gave the church and the bit of land associated with it to what later became Hyde Abbey, and they held it until about 1320, something like that, when Bisham Priory acquired it. And they continued to hold it up until the Reformation.
Well, anyway, here we are at the beginning of our trail, and we're starting from the square. Now, the square originally had a market, didn't it, Robert? Do you know much about the start of that market, or the beginning of it?
Well, we know that when Henry I granted the manor of Clare to the canons of Rouen, he granted the right to hold a market here. But there is a reference to tolls in Domesday Book, so there's probably a market here as early as 1066 at least. And it carried on a thriving market until the 18th century. But then, the beginning of the 19th century, it gradually died, and there was very little evidence of a market here at all by 1859.
Well, Chrissie, you must have many memories of the square, don't you?
Oh yes, and the square was always a meeting place, and also it's where we began our shopping. The square had the big shop, which was the post office. It used to be very frightening to me as a small child because it was so dark and gloomy and full of cobwebs. I used to try and stand outside, but my mother used to make me go in. Inside, you walked into a big cave, and there was a little wooden counter, if I remember, with a little old lady in black who came up and served and gave you stamps. At the other end of the square, where the newsagent is now, it used to be Bainham's drapery shop.
Right.
But then there was always some people on the square. There was always a gang of men sitting on the seat around the lamp and talking to each other.
In Swan Street, once known as South Street, the centre of the village consists of houses that were almost entirely timber-framed, but have now been clad with brick. The age of these buildings are often difficult to determine, as they've been rebuilt over the centuries. The medieval village would have consisted of buildings, many of whose top floors hung out of the street, just like that part of the Falcons that juts out so picturesquely. The timber framing, which is for the most part hidden, is often revealed by the end of the buildings, as here by these buildings in the square. And of course, carrying on down Swan Street, there must be plenty of shops and plenty of memories there as well, Chrissie.
Yes, well, the chemist was the first one. That was owned by Mr. Riley. He lived in the house next to it. A very nice man, very kind, very caring. if you ran into trouble with an accident, you went down there and he'd get supplies like first aid, dressings, bandages, things like that. He was always willing to try and help people. The next shop was always the butcher's, and then you had the fire station, which is now where the chemist is. They had to be a bit careful of the fire engines, because if they didn't fill the engine right up full to the top with water, it was too big to get inside the gap which they had to back into.
Oh, goodness me.
But they used to have the siren to turn the crew out in the yard of the council offices. So we used to know when the fire engine was going out. We all used to run down and watch them going out onto the...
A moment of big excitement.
Oh, absolutely.
What are your memories of the blacksmiths?
Oh, the blacksmith shop. At one time there were 4 or 5 blacksmiths there, but the blacksmith shop belonged to Mr. Walter Wallace. Well, then he died and his wife carried on for a bit, and then she got fed up with it, I suppose. And my father was the only blacksmith there then, and he worked with her, but then he took it over from her, and he owned it then, but he only rented it.
Yes. What other memories do you have of the other shops in Swan Street? I understand you didn't get on too well with was it Mrs. Pryor, at number 18 that would be, where Mortimer's was?
Yeah. Yes, I went there once, just after the war, when we had rationing, still had rationing. I went with a little ticket to get some sugar, and she weighed it off, and she was in the habit of dabbing her thumb down, and
on the scale. On
the scale, so make it. If the balance was just this way, she.
Yes.
You know, people used to do that. Shopkeepers, when they were balancing it, if they were a bit tight, they didn't overdo it. So that was how that went. Mortimer's. That was a bakery.
Yes.
Just this side, there was a shop front there. I don't know if you remember or not. And that was Cideries. Cideries had that, and they were bakers and cake makers and all that sort of thing. And a bit further along, well, that's all boarded up now. That was old Elf Hobbs, the saddler.
Yes.
We used to go. There was a boy who used to go along there and look through the window to watch him sewing the leather and all that.
That's next door to Mr. Florence, the number.
That's right.
20.
That is Mr. Florence. That's where he lived, where old Elf Hobbs lived.
The next building of interest is one of the most interesting in Kingsclere, the Swan. Now, that's remembered in folk history as the place where King John spent a terrible night, and was commemorated in the weather vane on the tower of the church, so the bedbug that so irritated King John. Do you believe there could be any truth in this story, Robert?
Well, not really. When I first heard the story, it was about the falcon and not about the swan. And since neither was an inn in King John's reign, or most unlikely to be an inn in King John's reign, the story is highly improbable. But it's a good story, so we don't want to kill it.
No, most enjoyable story, yes.
The Swan itself, first reference to the tenement, which later became the Swan, is in, I think, 1382. There's very good continuous records in the muniments of Winchester College. It was bringing up to 1490 when Thomas Bladen gave it to the college.
So the building is obviously older than it looks from the outside. When I saw it first, it looked very much like a Victorian pub. It was only when I got permission to climb up into the roof that I discovered, to my astonishment, this enormous area of smoke-blackened timbers that very evidently dated from the Middle Ages. These timbers show that the central area of the building was a hall in which stood a fire, and the smoke would have escaped through at most a cowl at one end of the hall, or just permeated outside through the thatch or the tiles. The carving on the trusses, interestingly, are only on the side where the seated owner would have seen them. The kitchen and buttery would have been where the bar now is, with sleeping accommodation for the master of the house above. And continuing further down, I mean, you starred on the stage at the Albert Hall, I understand, Chrissie.
Well, the Albert Hall was the most important place in the village. I was in the ballet and tap classes run by Mrs. Smith, who was the headmaster's wife. And I think my first effort on that stage was when I was 4 as a rabbit in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Oh, wonderful.
But everything used to happen in the Albert Hall. All our main parties, big concerts. We used to have a pantomime every year with Mrs. Smith's troupe, and then there were other pantomimes and other concerts. Had the Black Dyke Mills band down there for one concert, and that really shook the whole place.
Goodness,
The volume of noise down there was terrific. But all our sort of big things happened there. The Women's Institute shows, the Gardeners' annual show, my own wedding reception, had 2 pantomimes for brownies down there. It was the one place that we actually had our main occupation down there. My father's old-time dance club was from there. Classes every week, dances every Saturday night, whist drives, parties, you name it, it was there.
The real centre of the village.
Yeah, we even had a cinema show for a bit there every Saturday, which was very noisy, but quite good fun.
24 Swan Street was once a very fine house, built in the William and Mary style in 1720. It was added to quite considerably after it was taken over by the Kingsclere and Whitchurch District Council to become council offices. In 1974 it became a community centre, and then after the Fieldgate Centre was built, it reverted to private use. Here we have the now defunct Lloyd's Bank, once a school before the war, and the site for the discovery of a Bronze Age skeleton. There are a number of interesting houses as we walk down Swan Street. Here was the Bolton Arms, one of the many public houses named after the lord of the manor and owner of the property. The house would appear to be 18th century, although the rear end of the building probably dates from the 17th century. At the bottom of Swan Street we've got the pound where they used to keep the stray animals, which was
Oh yes.
which was very kind of them because being so close to the stream there, at least they were able to water them. And here also was a spot where people gathered to go and work in the common fields, which were the fields between here and Cottington Hill, which you can see in the distance.
Yes, they in fact extended both sides, not only Cottington Hill, up all across the rear of Kingsclere.
Yes. I mean, it's amazing how long they were maintained in this area, wasn't it? They,
Agriculturally, I think Kingsclere must have been a bit backward. It always lacked a resident lord of the manor, which always created problems because nobody's terribly interested in improving things. And I think that's a problem. You see, Lord Bolton lived away half the time up in Yorkshire and half the time near Basingstoke.
It's just a short walk along the Winchester Road to Gailey Mill. Strangely, the Winchester Road that now exists was only built at the end of the 18th century. Until then, the road ran along the other side of the Kingsclere Brook. I just loved the position of Gailey Mill. Mentioned in Domesday Book, owned by the lords of the manor down the centuries, it's the perfect place to stop on a hot summer's day and enjoy the cool of the shade of the trees by the bubbling brook. The building we see here is partly 19th century and partly earlier. It always seems to me a great shame that the mill portion of the building has not been restored. Someone's going to have great fun doing it up sometime in the future. And so just a short distance up here, we reach the last stop of the first Millennium Trail, Kingsclere House. Well, this is a very grand house, Kingsclere House. It's now divided in two, but what a splendid lawn we have here, rolling down to the lake. Originally it was called Foxgrove Farm. The map of Lord Bolton's estate of 1725, Lord Bolton was the lord of the manor then, showed that this place belonged to a Harry Gray, who is one of the first people in the area connected to horse racing. He owned other land in the area, and about the same time the Duke of Cumberland was using Cannon Court just behind White Hill for racing. Interesting, that house was apparently built from bricks taken from old Basing House. Eventually that was knocked down and John Porter moved the racing stables to the present Park House, where training continues today. This house continues to have a connection with racing and was enlarged by the Portal family when they owned it in about 1890. During the First World War, it was used as a hospital. And down here by the lake, of course, is another beautiful spot. This lake originally provided a source of water to turn the wheel for the town mill. Old maps show that this lake is much, or was then much larger than it is now, to provide the head of water for the town mill. Well, here we are at the beginning of the second trail. Robert, the churchyard here has obviously changed quite considerably since the early days.
Oh yes, originally the churchyard lay entirely to the south of the church. There was a superstition which rather prevented people having churchyards on the north of churches, which I only discovered quite recently, but that is so apparently. And this particular area was simply the site of 12 houses, their gardens, a skittle alley, a workshop, and on the corner here, the Vine Inn.
Oh, excellent.
This part was converted into the churchyard about 1848 onwards. And interesting record that one of the jockeys from Park Stable was buried in the what do you call it?
The cellar?
In the cellar of the cellar of the inn.
Oh, knowing how much the...
He was apparently a noted jockey.
Well, some of the jockeys, of course, do enjoy a drink, don't they? So maybe it was a very appropriate place for him
It's a
to...
connection, but he was a man apparently of impeccable character, so they say. So I don't really know. But it'd be the end of the 19th century we're talking about.
Oh, right. And do you remember the brewery when it was...
Yes, the brewery that was owned by Mr. W.I. Drake, and I can remember Charlie Hillier was the drayman with the old horse and cart, and he had two fairly big horses, and he used to have barrels of beer, and he used to come out of the yard and go up over the downs to Overton and Whitchurch with a beer, and because they had pubs there, they owned, more or less owned the pubs.
Right.
W.I. Drake did.
Here we have the old house, certainly a very handsome mansion. On the outside we have a date which is 1684, and is probably correct for the age of the building, though there are features inside which could be part of an older building. If you look at the bricks, you can see they are smaller than present-sized ones. These attractive 2-inch bricks were used until bricks began to be taxed, after which their size was increased until something like the size of present bricks. And continuing along further, we come to Cedar Drive, which was the Tower Hill. In fact, you know it well because you live quite close to it, didn't you?
Yes, well, we lived in the next cottages up the road there, but the Knightsmith family were in Tower Hill House, and they had evacuees boarded with them during the war. There were always 6 evacuees, and the whole way down to the lime tree from our old cottages used to have a very high wall, and you'd walk up there and sometimes you'd feel somebody watching you, and you'd look up and then you'd see these faces peering over the wall at you. There was
goodness me.
Usually Miss Sylvia, Miss Felicity and their big Airedale dog, and they were watching us, but they were busy, they were talented. You go past the house and you'd hear music coming from it. The front room was their music room. They had a big piano, and one played the cello, one played the violin, one played the flute. There's lots of nice music coming from the house.
At the bottom of North Street we have Prior Mill, named not after the canons of Rouen, but after the Prior family that lived in Kingsclere for centuries, and unfortunately died out about 15 years ago with the death of George Prior. North Street has a particular charm all of its own. Love Lane may only be a small footpath now, but the older maps show it as a road. Up here on the right we have the Tannery Cottages. Old maps show that there were once more buildings leading down to the stream, where water was obviously taken for use in tanning. The smell must have been appalling, not what today's residents would want.
Then farther on down the North Street where Brook House, as they call it. Brook House,
Yes,
is it?
at the bottom, yes.
Then Old Tommy Armstrong lived there. He was a little. He came out of the stables, and he was sort of the tout for the racehorses. You know, give the tips.
Oh, he used to live there, did he?
Tommy Armstrong.
He
did.
must have made some money from
giving the tips, I suppose. He was obviously he was a jockey. I think he could have been a jockey.
A Priory Mill. That was owned by the Pras.
That's Priory, but I don't think they did any milling at that time. It was.
Oh, tell us that. What was that story?
Well, you see, when I was taking the meat round, I used to have to take the meat.
This is the butcher's boy.
The butcher's boy. I used to take the meat down to Mrs. Pryor down there, and on one occasion, I had some meat in the basket was a wicker basket thing. I don't know what the basket was anyway, but that's besides the point. There was meat was in the basket, and she had about 3 pence or 4 pence for suet on the top. And I rang the bell and I looked down, and the cat was running away with the suet. So I chased the cat. I chased the cat, and the cat dropped the suet, and I got it back into the basket before she come to the door. So she didn't know much about that.
You must have memories of the school as well.
Oh yeah. That's where I went to before the medical centre was there.
Yes.
We used to call the Lytton School.
Yes.
The Lytton School. There was wooden doors, and there was the Lytton on the wooden doors. And I went there as a child, and Mrs. Weston was my teacher at one time. We used to sit on that silly thing to do, sit on the pipes around there, the hot water pipes. And I can also remember having sand trays and writing A, B and C in the sand trays. And then we used to stand back to back with a slate board when they were saying spell the words out, you start spelling, somebody say write down what so-and-so means, you were back to back so you couldn't copy one another, you see, on these slate boards.
Well, the crown here, that appears, at least on the front, to date from 1853, although I know, having climbed up inside the roof, there are at least 2 older buildings here. Robert, what do you know about the crown?
Well, the crown, the first mention of the crowns I've come across in 1575 in the Royal Purveyance, which was done at that time. It was then said to be in the Guildhall tithing. And this suggests to my mind that it was in fact probably a guild house before it was a pub. Now a guild house was largely, I regret to say, a drinking club with religious overtones. See, in the time of Edward VI, all chantry chapels, guild houses were closed down and taken over by the Crown. And this would make sense. Guild house, a building belonged to the Crown Inn, a natural progression. You can't know this for certain. I've asked the Public Record Office if they can help on this, but they haven't replied yet.
The one thing that people remember the Crown for, of course, is that most unfortunate incident during the war.
Mrs. Napper's shooting?
Yes.
Yeah, that was dreadful.
What do you remember of it?
The whole village was shocked. Obviously, we all talked about it. There was lots of reporters there, more police than I've ever seen.
Yes.
Coming past as children, we all peered at the hole where the bullet went through, which was quite good fun, really.
Yes.
Opposite was Mrs. Hopkins, drapery, wool, needles, ribbons, those sort of things in Fanny Hopkins.
Yes.
Then you started going up George Street, and you had the blacksmiths, which was Sam Garrett's.
Yeah, that must have been exciting.
Oh, that was fun. You went there to see the horses shod and helped tie them up and helped hold them. I was allowed to pump the bellows to get the fire going. I was even allowed to use the hammer and bang some hot metal once or twice, but not very often. But he was a nice man. He was nice to the children, and nice to be with. Used to go into the rope yard, Carter's rope yard.
That's where Sasso's is now.
That's right, yes. We were allowed to go up to the doors, but we weren't allowed in because there was lots and lots of flying ropes and pulleys and fine brown dust everywhere, and the smell of the hemp I shall always remember. But I bought my skipping ropes there for 6pence, and they were quite nice, but we had to be very careful. We weren't allowed anywhere in the workshop.
Of course, the village club must have been quite a centre for
Yes, yeah,
village activity.
yeah. As I say, the old billiards and that, it fascinated me, and I went there when I was 15, because you couldn't join until you was 15, and as soon as I'd finished work, I'd go tearing off up there to get on these tables before anyone else got there, because there was no electricity. We had to light the gas. We had gas things.
And next to it are the almshouses.
That's right, yes. The present houses were built by the Mrs. Holdings. The Holding family lived at just near there, and they were very generous to the village. But originally it was Thomas Brown, who was vicar of Kingsclere, who endowed the almshouses for 8 old men. Very strict regulations they have, and I might read you just one or two as illustrating the sort of thing that
That's
he
interesting,
thought.
yes.
First of all, they should be of good name, and especially religious. None should be chosen to the almshouse that have any of these diseases: a leprosy, the French pox, the falling sickness, or any such foul and loathsome disease that may annoy the residue. The women lie in their several rooms from the men, and the men from their women, taking great care about that. None lie out themselves out of their own houses within the town without a special knowledge given to the ancientest man or woman for lack thereof. If any do, the person so offended shall lose 6pence, and so on it goes on. Their doors should be shut at 9 o'clock in summer and 8 in winter, and not be opened until the next morning, but in time of great extremity or occasion.
Well, here where the road goes up to the dell was originally the road to Basingstoke. The new Basingstoke road was in fact built in 1842. So the
Right.
road past the dell was the road to Basingstoke. Hard to believe.
It is, isn't it? I've only ever known it as a bridle path.
Remember the houses in the dell?
Yes, because my great-grandmother used to live there in Rose Cottage, and that's where I used to stay quite a lot of my childhood time. There weren't as many houses in the dell as there are now, and they were still actually taking chalk from the face there. They used to warn us on the day that they were going to let off an explosion and knock some more chalk down.
Oh, they actually used explosives, did
Yes, there used to be a bang. We used to have to shut all the windows very tight and the doors, and there'd be this bang, and then there'd be a cloud of white dust over the whole area. You had to make sure you weren't putting washing out that day. My grandmother used to moan about it because it made everything so dusty.